Thank you. New today, the Democratic primary to replace retiring Governor Tony Evers just got a bit bigger. Democratic State Representative Francesca Hong of Madison has now entered the race for governor. She says universal child care, funding public education, and cheaper health care will be her top priorities if she's elected governor. Here's an excerpt from our interview with her earlier this week.
You're the first Asian American state legislator in Wisconsin. If elected, you would be the first ever woman governor in Wisconsin. What is that like?
That would be an honor, but that would also be a great responsibility to meet the moment as someone who has to do more than just representation.
So Hong will join Democrats Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley and Lieutenant Governor Sarah Rodriguez, as well as beer vendor Ryan Sternad in the race for governor. That was the Democrats. On the Republican side, you got businessman Bill Berrien and Washington County Executive Josh Schoeman, who are also running.